Good afternoon. I'm Anna Carugati, the Group Editorial Director of WorldScreen. I am delighted to be today with Tim Kring.
Hello.
He is not only President and CEO of TKIMPERATIVE,
Yes,
he is perhaps better known as a very successful creator and showrunner in the United States. He's best known for the shows Crossing Jordan, Heroes, Touch. I think what we want to focus on in this session today is anywhere you go in the Palais nowadays, they're talking about how digital platforms are challenging business models, revolutionizing the business. I think there's a very interesting perspective to be examined, which is how are all these new platforms influencing the storytelling process?
Right.
So I thought, as all good stories have a beginning, if we could go back to the beginning of your career and tell us a little bit, when did you first know that you wanted to write?
I was raised, my formative years, early years, were in the 1960s, and I was raised with enough of a social conscience to know that I wanted to do something that was important in the world. And I know it's going to seem strange, how did I go from that to Hollywood? But there's a story there, an arc there. I was always interested in kind of big questions. I was interested in why are we here, and what's the meaning of life? And so much so that I ended up getting a degree in religious studies in college. But since there isn't much of a buck in that racket, I had to figure out how to do something else. But I was also interested in photography and cinematography. I ended up going to film school, and I wanted to work in the visual arts. And I got out of film school and I started to work in production for a few years. And I got job after job working, production kind of jobs on camera crews mostly. And one day I had the opportunity to get into the union, the camera union. And it was at that point in my sort of new career, I guess, that I had to kind of look at what I really wanted to do. And being in the union at that time, somebody had to die for you to get into the union. It was a big deal.
Absolutely.
And I had this sort of fork in the road, like, do I want to punch a clock for the rest of my life, or do I feel like I have something to say? And I thought I had something to say. I didn't know what it was. But also at the same time, a bunch of my friends were getting jobs, were writing scripts, and entering Hollywood at a fairly high level because of writing a script. And so I sat down and wrote a script, and from that script I got an agent who worked out of his apartment, and from that agent I got 100 meetings set up, and from those 100 meetings I finally ended up getting my first job as a writer, writing for a talking car on a show called Knight Rider, and that was 28 years ago.
My goodness.
And I've never sort of stopped working as a writer ever since.
You never looked back.
So in terms of like when did I want to become, I don't know that I ever really thought about it in those terms.
And back then, certainly Knight Rider, and then the shows you did after that, the American marketplace was dominated by 3 networks.
Yep.
At that time, when you were writing a 1-hour drama, sort of explain to us what the strictures, what parameters did you have to work within in terms of storytelling?
Right. Well, like you said, first of all, there were only 3 buyers. There were 3 entities where you could sell scripted show at the time. There was very little, other than, I guess, the soaps hadn't really, well, they were just starting at that time. The Dallas and Dynasty kind of soaps. But for the most part, television at that time was really closed-ended, procedural storytelling, shows that would repeat well, shows that could go into syndication. And it was also kind of a closed system in terms of the 2 worlds of features and TV never really crossed one another. You kind of had to come up through the ranks in order to get a show, to even write a pilot. you had to work on staff and do all that. It was years until after that, until you started to see some crossover between features and playwrights and that kind of thing coming into television. Okay. So at that time, it was this sort of closed world, and it was in a way, the kind of redheaded stepchild to the feature world. You were nobody. I don't think I knew anybody who came to Hollywood to work in television. It was just not what you did. You came to Hollywood to work in features, and then you got a job in television. And and what was interesting about that for me is that I actually worked in both worlds a little bit. I was a TV movie writer back in the day when they made lots and lots of TV movies. And I actually saw sort of firsthand how different those two worlds were. The feature world that I worked in also was, it was this big amorphous kind of world where nothing ever really happened, and everybody always had some big star attached to a project, but you never saw it come to fruition. And television was very immediate, and if somebody told you they had a big star attached to the show, then you would know on Tuesday when we went into production, because it was happening that quickly. And so I kind of got to see the two worlds side by side, and I really came to appreciate the much more reality-based version of a career working in television.
And in terms of a 1-hour drama back then, was it formulaic in terms of storytelling? You had to fit in the commercials. How did the story play out over the course of the hour?
Well, yeah, it was a very, you had, at the time, I've watched over the years the amount of, the length of an hour of television. When I first started, the length of an hour of television was 49 and a half minutes. It's now down to 43 and going even lower. Pretty soon, an hour of TV is going to be a half hour. So there was that, and then there were also it was also less number of commercials. I mean, less commercial breaks. And I remember when they inserted those extra commercial breaks into the hour, it was very complicated for a lot of us writers, because we had just gotten used to this sort of 3-act structure, then a 4-act structure, and now a 5-act structure. And so that's another thing that's changing.
Okay, let's move forward in time. So, Crossing Jordan, that was, did you start at that point to experiment with new ways of storytelling, or with what shows?
Well, it's interesting. That was, for years I worked as a freelance writer, and I had one job after another, and my sort of goal as a writer was just to work. I didn't have any rhyme or reason to how I looked for a job. I took any job that came my way. I did this as a joke. I made a business card for myself, and part of the joke of that is that no writer in Hollywood ever has a business card. You just don't do that. But I made myself a little business card, and it had a little sort of little cartoon head on it with a little light bulb over the head, and it said, "Tim Kring, professional writer. I'll write anything." And it was really kind of a metaphor for the way I kind of approached my life. And I started to think that, because I never had a fork in the road, I never had an option. I just took whatever job came my way. It was right around when I got Crossing Jordan, which was my first show that was my own show. It was the first time that I started to have a fork in the road, where I was like, oh, I could write about this, or I could write about that. And I started to really want to understand if there was some underlying theory of everything about my career. Was there something I really wanted to say? Was there something I really that would help me when I had these kind of these sort of fork in the road times in my career? I could use it as a true north and understand why I wanted to do certain things. And I really struggled with it and couldn't really figure it out. And Crossing Jordan started in 2001, and we were in production very early on in the first season when 9/11 happened. And I remember being really struck. We took one day off of production and had to come back the next day. And we all kind of stumbled back into work the next day. And I remember being struck by this contrast of this make-believe world that we were creating with actors who were, saying words that weren't really their own on sets that weren't really real, and all of it just feeling so strange and phony in contrast to this, genuine tragedy that was gripping the whole world. And I started to really want to say something about what had happened. And I wrote an episode of that show. It was an episode called Miracles and Wonders. It was a story of a kind of a daisy chain of events that connected seemingly unconnected people together, who all ended up being connected by a very, what seemed like random, but turned out not to be random circumstances. And it was this one idea for the show that actually got me realizing that was a subject that I really wanted to talk about, was this idea of interconnectivity, of how people's lives are actually reflected on one another and shine on one another. And that was something that anybody who's now seen my work for the next 12 years or so has seen that very much was a theme in what I was doing. And I also started to realize that I wanted to use narrative and use this idea of this theme of interconnectivity to try to create and promote some positive change in the world. And so my writing really changed after that. And it happened to coincide with a time when the audience was beginning to watch TV in a very, very different way. Until then, there was really only a one-way street between me and the audience.
Right.
I would push content out into the world, and they would maybe respond back through the Nielsen ratings. That was about all you
That was
knew.
the only response you would get, right? Numbers.
And it was a couple of months later. I mean,
Right.
You'd write this thing, and 2 months later. So I had no relationship at all with my audience. And I started to realize with it, like on the show Crossing Jordan, and seeing that the ratings starting to slip for all of television, and audiences starting to fragment and go away, that the next show that I wanted to create, I wanted to not only use this idea of interconnectivity and the concept of it, but I wanted to actually try to have people connect to the show in all of these new ways. And so that's something that we were able to do with Heroes, was create this huge kind of platform around the show that allowed people to access content from all of these new emerging platforms.
But at that point, was any extra storytelling or any extra information online more of an afterthought, or was it baked
Right.
in, so to speak, into the story? And you've since progressed from
Yeah.
that point, haven't you?
I think the idea, there's a lot of things that started to converge right about now. First of all, you're right. The role of the ancillary or extensions of a show were really about promo and about marketing for the show. But what we realized was that it was actually a way to take story that we wanted to put out into the world and actually have it live in these different platforms. And so we took the philosophy with Heroes that almost like there was no wasted piece of the narrative. We used every part of the buffalo. I mean, we had story that would exist only on mobile, or we had story that would exist, we had story that existed on the back of the boxes of the merchandise that we sold. When we sold a replica sword that Hiro Nakamura had, on the back of the box would be a story about where that sword came from that was only gotten there. So this idea that we now had a universe, a story world that we created that could be accessed from different angles, that was something that was a brand new way of thinking. And then something else really occurred with Heroes. This idea that was underlying on the show of kind of interconnectivity and global consciousness that was really built in, under, riding underneath the genre of the show, I think really started to connect to the audience in a very powerful way. And it was in dealing with this audience in a new and dynamic way that got me to realize that there might be a way to take story and roll it out, not simply in fiction, but into the real world. And so out of Heroes came an idea for a project called Conspiracy for Good that took this idea of multi-platform storytelling and kind of went a little bit kind of crazy with it. And that it was a project that we did for Nokia. It was the first branded content that I did. And it was a large multi-platform narrative that started online, then rolled out into mobile, and then eventually onto the streets of London we had up to 40 actors on the streets of London. And the interesting thing about the project was that it actually incorporated real-world results as a result of this narrative and your participation inside this narrative. We were able to build and stock 5 libraries in eastern Zambia, donated 10,000 books, and gave away 50 scholarships to schoolgirls.
So before we show the clip, set it up for us. The story is basically this woman who...
Yeah, so the story that we told, we created this, like I said, this big online narrative that then rolled out into the real world. And the story that we decided to tell was the story of a school teacher in Zambia who wants to build a library for her kids, only to find that there's this evil multinational corporation that has built a pipeline through the school grounds. And so she decides, in a kind of David and Goliath way, to take it upon herself to go and confront this evil corporation. And that's sort of the story that we told. But it was accessed through all of these different platforms. And if we can roll that clip.
We can see the clip now.
No.
Be on your guard.
In 2010, London witnessed the global launch of the Conspiracy for Good, a new form of entertainment called social benefit storytelling, which allowed people's participation inside a story to do real good in the real world. Released across the web, mobile and music, it became the most ambitious cross-platform story ever launched. And this is the story they told. Recording artist Nadira X puts her career on hold to build a library for an elementary school in Zambia. But British-based multinational Blackwell Briggs halts construction of the library to make way for an oil pipeline. Nadira uncovers a document proving the company's claim to the land is false and sets out on an epic journey to London to expose their fraudulent actions. Moved by Nadira's mission, people from around the world joined an ancient secret society known as the Conspiracy for Good. To help her cause, they watched her story across 21 webisodes as they guide her in real time from Zambia to London, deciphering clues and hacking the Blackwell Briggs website. When Nadira arrives in London, the action bursts from the web and onto the streets, with 4 weeks of real-world gameplay and live theatre, where conspirators take part in digital scavenger hunts to solve the story's mystery and celebrate the day's action with secret underground concerts. In the end, urgent calls via social media networks result in flash mobs that overwhelm security forces and topple Blackwell's corrupt CEO. And to complete Nadira's mission, the audience use in-story tools to help her build a real library in Zambia, $1 and 1 book at a time.
You can't stop me. No, you can't stop me. If you're not a man. You can't stop me. Not at all. You can't stop me. Be on your
The Conspiracy for Good. Are you a member?
Wow. Excellent.
It was an amazing project that had we had 130 people working in 5 countries on the project, and very complicated project to do because none of us had ever done anything like it before, and so and nor was there any template for it, so nobody knew even the right questions to ask. We were just kind of making it up as it went along. But it had this very powerful effect on people who were involved with it, because I think there's a realization that narrative and storytelling is this very powerful tool to get people to come out of their homes and into the real world to do something. And you can see that power when if you've ever had the rare pleasure, I guess, of going to Comic-Con in San Diego, you see this ability for a story or a narrative or a story world to engage people to they come down, they put on costumes, they make it a family vacation. And it was really sort of taking that idea that people's interest in a narrative can be a very powerful thing. In this case, we were able to roll it out in the real world and do something positive with it.
Right, and that must have been very satisfying. Yeah. But was that also your first time that you were working with a brand? With a brand,
yes. I mean, listen, I had started to work with brands on heroes in a real way. Before then, there was always a bit of a firewall between a showrunner and the brands. Networks like to keep a bit of distance between the showrunners and the brands. But we're starting to see that that's really changing, and brands are getting more and more involved in having a relationship with storytellers. And now that brands have an access to their customers that I would call an audience,
right.
It sort of now behooves them to create relationships directly with storytellers and kind of go around the networks and studios. And they're starting to see that some of them have 15 million people on their Facebook pages and an audience that's reachable very easily to them. And so it's now getting to a point where I think when a lot of us started, and even before we started in television, when you used to have, the Texaco Hour or
right.
Kraft Food Presents, we were, I think, much more comfortable with the idea that brands were very involved with bringing you content. And I think that that's actually coming back in a very big way. I think, my kids seem to be very comfortable with the idea that somebody's paying for the content. So working with brands, I think is now a real opportunity to create some pretty powerful stuff. Last year, just about a year ago this time, I worked on a project called Daybreak.
And there you got to work with
AT&T, yeah.
Right. And certainly for a brand, because fewer people are watching commercials, this opens up a new way for the brands to get
right.
their message out rather than have a 30-second spot that is skipped right through.
Yeah, I think the 30-second spot obviously is becoming a problem for television. I mean, for big brands with the fact that you can skip through them and you never know who's watching, and
right.
it's not a very targeted way to reach people.
But with Daybreak, you're saying so
right.
there it was AT&T.
Yeah,
right?
so and the interesting thing about working with a big tech company is that you're able to utilize their technology, and I found that working with a company like AT&T actually made me some of this technology we were using actually they're tools for telling story, and where some people may see it an application as an augmented reality application, and they see its usage in, I don't know, healthcare or something. I see it as a storytelling tool. So Daybreak was a project that we had attached in a slight way to my show Touch, but then extended off of that, and was basically a narrative that existed online, and we created 50 minutes of content, so basically the same length as a pilot for television. Right. And what was really incredible about it was the amount of production value that we were able to do. We shot it and edited it and made it exactly in the same way that you would any pilot. Probably spent close to the same amount of money on it that we did for a big pilot. And I think it sort of proves the that these things don't have to be a kind of stepchild to big production, Hollywood production. They actually can be quite large.
Because I'm sure there are many people who are interested in how you bring a brand into a narrative. Tell us a little bit, what's been your experience with, like you said, there used to be a firewall, and suddenly you're talking with the brand.
Yeah.
How do you keep control of the story you want to tell, but accommodate their needs?
Well, I think one of the things that I think a lot of brands are starting to realize is that the idea of product integration, shilling for their product, and people holding up a Coke can like this, is not really the most effective way to get sort of brand loyalty. I think audiences really feel a kind of kinship with a brand when they feel that brand made it possible for them to be entertained for an hour. So somebody like AT&T understood that they wanted to stay far enough in the background. Now, we obviously used some of their applications, and there were cell phones and stuff in the show, but no more than usual. But they got the kind of halo effect off of being responsible for this hour of content. And I think people can end up having a kind of warm feeling when they go into the store to shop because they had this this sort of hour of entertainment.
Connection with that story. Other ways that technology is changing your craft. Certainly we as viewers now, because of the availability of viewing on demand in however, whether on computer or online, there's this phenomenon that has grown up which is called binge viewing. Okay, I have a Saturday off, it's raining, and I'm going to watch 5 episodes in a row of my favorite show. How is that affecting your work?
Well, I think you really landed on a big thing that's going on right now and changing so much of, it's hard to know what the implications are going to be, but right now you're really, I think, seeing, first of all, the idea of watching these shows in a condensed period is almost taken over for the idea of reading a book. And that same feeling that you have when you're reading a really good book and somebody asks you how you are and what's going on in your life. A minute into the conversation, you'll say, I'm reading this really great book.
Right.
Well, people now have that same thing of, I'm almost through the 3rd season of Breaking Bad.
Right.
And it is changing, I think, the way that we are now looking at this, serialized storytelling, first of all, has really become synonymous with this idea that having these cliffhanger endings to the episodes really helps with this idea of binge viewing. But it's also, I think, changing the length of these series and changing the way that we are thinking about, number of episodes. We always, in network TV, started with 22 episodes, and sometimes you do 24, sometimes you do 25. And that was always a big problem, especially when you had a serialized show, because you had to stall, you found yourself having to stall. And you're finding now, I think, that this new way of watching is really helping to determine the optimum length for these shows. In the same way that a song is 2.5 minutes on the radio, or a movie is 2 hours in the movie theater. It seems that 10, 12, 13 episodes seems to be the right length for these kind of binge viewing that people want to do.
And to go back to Daybreak, because we don't want to neglect the clip,
Right.
People are also getting used to watching more bite-sized storytelling online.
Yes,
correct?
yeah, and that again continues to be an ever-moving, target as to what's the optimum length for watching a kind of a clip online. With Daybreak, we carved it into. We had 50 minutes, and we carved it into basically 6-minute, kind of 6 or 7 minute episodes. I have a very short clip. The only reason to show this is just to give you a sense of the kind of production value that we were able to do on a branded content piece. So if we want to show that
Can
clip.
we see the Daybreak clip, please?
Martin was murdered last night. You were the last person to see him alive.
Ben, your father was on the verge of a major breakthrough.
It's like nothing you've ever seen on this earth.
And he started to believe he was being followed.
He's here.
And all that matters is that we are on the same team.
You can't trust anyone, understand? Look, I'll contact you through the app. Look for the jacks.
No one will fault you if you choose to walk away. The threat we're up against is not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, anyway, it's just as I said, you can see that we shot it in a style that was, very consistent with the quality of stuff that I was used to working on.
So what we said early in the session was that when you started your career, there were basically 3 networks. The landscape is,
Yeah.
Back then it would have been unimaginable to imagine how many channels there are today, plus the different platforms.
Yeah, I think there's something like 30-some places where you can sell a show nowadays.
So is it harder to find an audience, and how do you go about doing that?
I don't know that it's harder to find an audience. It has certainly changed. The idea of having to, clearly it's now easier as a writer to find a platform there are more and more ways to obviously reach an audience. And the one thing that's, the ubiquity of the pen doesn't mean that everybody's Hemingway. You still need to tell a great story. And I think that this idea of creating shows that have a broad audience is harder and harder to do. But what you can do nowadays is have a deep audience. And a deep audience can be a very rewarding audience to have. So you can have a niche audience that wants to be involved in that show in a very deep way. They want to connect with each other, with the other fans. They will speak back and forth to you as the showrunner. So that broad audience has been somewhat replaced by a deep audience, but I find it kind of a rewarding thing to have that.
And that need that so many of us have now to interact in some way, even affect a story if possible, that leads into the project that you're working on now.
Yeah, and just to quickly, I think there are multiple ways to look at your relationship with the audience. You can just listen to them and occasionally try and figure out how to follow things that they're interested in, or you can hand over huge amounts of the story to them and allow them to be involved in it. A project that I'm involved with right now called the Drake Equation is a project that has from the very beginning the idea of baking into the DNA of the entire experience the way that you will reach it across multiple platforms. So it exists not only as a show on broadcast, but has all of these extensions that you can tap into. So it's a real-time digital narrative that exists all around you. The show has a kind of a fun sci-fi quality to it, but is very grounded in reality. It's an alien invasion show that has no aliens and no invasion. So it's all about the impending idea that something is coming and how the planet will actually come together and rally together to try to prevent this from happening. So it's very grounded in reality. But along the way, the audience is able to access all of this content in kind of real time through applications and mobile content, allowing you to have a relationship with the show that is ongoing and not just appointment viewing.
Right. It's a busy place inside your head. There's a lot of creativity going on in there all the time, isn't it?
And thankfully things stagger out in some respect, and you end up working on something for a very, very long time, feeling really proud of it, and then moving on to the next thing. I've had a career that's been a long career, and I still think of myself as a freelance writer, but I've learned now that it's less about making television for an audience and more about making it with the audience.
With them. All right. Well, on that beautiful note, thank you.
All
Thank
right,
you so much for being with us. Thank you.